You know, usually when we talk about a business contract, there's this expectation of something just incredibly mundane.
Right. It's, lawyers in a room.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Boilerplate language, a stack of papers sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere. You sign on the dotted line, you exchange goods for services, and, well, that's the end of it. It's just commerce functioning exactly as it's designed to.
It's the invisible scaffolding of the economy, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody really pays attention to the scaffolding unless it collapses.
Right. But then if you step into the world of early 20th century global oil, suddenly that filing cabinet is a Pandora's box.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a landscape where corporate paperwork wasn't just about, quarterly revenue. It was about geopolitics. It was about war and literally the survival of entire nations. So today, for you listening, we're doing a deep dive. We are opening up a massive stack of historical documents, government records, and scholarly research to explore a story that honestly, it sounds like a geopolitical thriller.
But it's entirely documented reality.
Exactly. We're looking at the aftermath of the famous 1911 U.S. Supreme Court decision that shattered the Standard Oil Trust. The biggest fragment of that monopoly, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which eventually evolved into Exxon, didn't just survive the breakup. They took that massive organizational machinery and they relocated their ambitions.
Yeah, they really did.
We're going to explore how this colossal corporation essentially built a parallel government in Latin America. I mean, we're talking about a company drafting laws for sovereign nations, negotiating directly with strongmen, and triggering massive national expropriations. And then we're going to trace that exact same diplomatic muscle across the Atlantic. We need to examine the grave, historically documented consequences of their 1929 cartel agreement with Nazi Germany's chemical engine, IG Farben.
And I think it's important to state right up front that the scope of what we're unpacking today requires a very specific lens. We're dealing with severe historical events here. We've got allegations involving the Third Reich, wartime espionage, profound impacts on national security. So our approach is grounded strictly in the documentary record.
Because there's a lot of noise out there.
There really is. There is an entire cottage industry of sensationalized myths surrounding this era. So our mission today is to meticulously map out what the historical documents actually prove. We want to examine the mechanics of how a corporation achieves that level of power, and we're going to explicitly pull apart the popular fictions that have kind of clouded the real verifiable events.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to put the hook right on the table for you listening. Think about a private American company so powerful and just so fiercely dedicated to its own global strategy that its business contracts actively mechanically undermine the military readiness of its own home country during World War II.
Yeah.
A situation so severe that a future U.S. president would publicly look at the evidence and use the word treason to describe it.
And the weight of that word, especially coming from someone like Harry Truman, is staggering.
It's massive.
But, a corporation doesn't just wake up one morning with the leverage to tangle with the Third Reich and the U.S. government simultaneously. To understand the mechanics of that power, we really have to rewind to the moment of their greatest vulnerability.
Right, the breakup.
Exactly. We have to look at how Standard Oil was forced to build this shadow empire in Latin America after being essentially legally decapitated at home.
Right. So the gavel comes down in Washington, D.C. The year is 1911. The case is Standard Oil Com. of New Jersey v. United States. And the Supreme Court basically looks at John D. Rockefeller's empire, the sprawling, unprecedented monopoly, and says, enough.
Yeah.
They order the trust to be broken into 34 separate companies, but the mechanics of how you actually break up a monopoly are crucial here, right? Because you don't just divide everything perfectly into 34 equal slices of pie.
No, not at all. The division was highly asymmetric, and that asymmetry is really the engine for everything that follows in this deep dive.
Okay, how so?
Well, for decades, Standard Oil had mastered both horizontal and vertical integration. They owned the wells, the pipelines, the refineries, the rail cars, everything. But when the Supreme Court drops the hammer under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the fragmentation leaves the pieces wildly unbalanced.
I see.
So the largest fragment that emerges from this legal earthquake is Standard Oil of New Jersey.
Which we'll call Jersey Standard as we go through this today. So Jersey Standard walks away from the breakup, and if you look at their asset sheet from 1911, it's weird. They're sitting on massive state-of-the-art refining capacity. They have this huge marketing network, fleets of ships. But they have this glaring existential problem, which is that they suddenly lack the crude oil reserves to feed their own machine.
Right. They were essentially left holding the world's largest engine, but someone else suddenly owned all the gasoline.
That's a great way to put it.
The domestic oil fields, particularly in regions like Ohio and Indiana, they ended up belonging to the other 33 fragments. So Jersey Standard recognized immediately that if they had to buy crude oil from their newly independent rival siblings at market rates, their profit margins would just disintegrate.
They'd be bled dry.
Exactly. Their survival depended on finding an ocean of crude oil that no one else controlled.
So they look at a map. The domestic market is this minefield of antitrust scrutiny and fierce new competitors. They realize the only play is to pivot aggressively outward. So they look southward to Latin America to secure the reserves they desperately need. And I just have to pause on the sheer audacity of this move.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. government just broke them up for acting like a ruthless monopoly, and their strategic response was essentially, fine, we'll go be a monopoly in someone else's country.
It was a geographical relocation of a corporate philosophy, really. I mean, they didn't change their fundamental operating system. They just exported it.
Right.
But the Latin America they entered in the 1920s was not a blank slate. They were walking into this rising intellectual, legal, and political movement that would come to define the entire century of global energy, a concept known as resource nationalism.
Resource nationalism. For you listening, this concept is basically the key to unlocking this entire era. Let's break down exactly how that functioned mechanically on the ground.
At its core, resource nationalism is a legal and philosophical conviction. It asserts that a nation's subsoil wealth, the minerals, the oil, the natural gas resting beneath the Earth's crust, inherently belongs to the nation itself.
Okay.
It's the collective property of the people of that sovereign state, regardless of who owns the surface land. Therefore, any foreign entity that comes in to drill or mine is merely a temporary contractor. They are not an absolute owner.
Which is a fundamental collision with how Jersey Standard operated back home, because they were accustomed to the American legal framework. In the U.S., if you buy the land, you own everything all the way down to the Earth's core, right? You own the dirt, you own the oil.
Exactly. So the clash was inevitable because Jersey Standard wasn't deploying geologists to Latin America merely to drill a few holes and, pay a standard export tax. They were operating as what political scientists call a parallel state.
A parallel state?
Yes. They utilized their massive capital advantage to secure vast concessions. They often dealt directly with dictatorial strongmen who needed cash to consolidate their own power. And the terms they demanded were just staggering.
Let's walk through what a parallel state actually looks like in practice, because we throw that term around, but the mechanics are fascinating. We aren't just talking about, lobbying here.
No. We are talking about a corporation actively undertaking the functions of a sovereign government. When Jersey Standard entered a remote region in Latin America, they built the roads. They constructed the deep water ports.
Wow.
They built entire company towns, complete with hospitals, schools, and, should be noted, segregated housing for American managers versus the local workers.
Right.
They set up their own internal communications networks. They essentially had their own private security forces. And perhaps most importantly, because these host nations often lacked sophisticated petroleum regulatory frameworks, Standard Oil's own corporate lawyers were frequently drafting the actual petroleum legislation that the local governments would then pass into law.
That is wild. They are literally writing the rules of the game they were playing.
Yes.
I mean, they had the capital and the technical expertise that these developing nations desperately needed, and they absolutely weaponized that leverage. They weren't negotiating as a guest in a foreign country. They were negotiating as a sovereign equal, bringing all the diplomatic weight of an empire.
And that autonomy is almost difficult to grasp in a contemporary context. I mean, they maintained their own intelligence gathering. They were predicting political shifts before official embassies even caught on.
But history dictates that a parallel government operating within the borders of an actual recognized government will eventually trigger a crisis of sovereignty, right?
The friction is totally unavoidable.
And the first major structural failure of Standard's Latin American empire didn't ignite in a bustling capital city like Caracas or Mexico City. It started out in one of the most remote, forbidding frontiers in South America.
Yes, the Bolivian southeast.
Specifically, the eastern lowlands bordering the Grand Chaco. And for you listening, this geographic area connects incredibly deeply to the broader theme of American enterprise in Latin America. If you've been following our Backyard Empire series, you know this terrain. The Bolivian lowlands are rugged, they are isolated, and they are unforgiving.
Very much so.
A generation after the events we were discussing today, American medical researchers were dropping into this exact same frontier to fight the Machupo virus, the black typhus. I actually have family ties to this specific region, and the stories of the landscape are wild. It's dense jungle just giving way to arid scrubland. It is completely disconnected from the political center up in the Andes, and the fact that American medical researchers were drawn there in the 1950s makes total sense when you realize that American oil wildcatters from Standard Oil had already blazed a trail, built camps, and mapped the terrain decades earlier. It's this continuous pattern of U.S. enterprise, whether armed with microscopes or drill bits, just stamping its footprint onto the deepest parts of the Latin American map.
And the isolation of the Gran Chaco is critical to understanding the conflict here. In the 1920s, Standard Oil of Bolivia, which was Jersey Standard's local subsidiary, acquired massive concession rights across this eastern frontier. They brought in heavy equipment at exorbitant cost. I mean, they were battling the geography itself just to set up drilling rigs.
Yeah.
But the catalyst for their eventual expulsion wasn't just a basic dispute over oil royalties. It was a geopolitical catastrophe that engulfed the entire region, the Chaco War.
Right. So we are looking at the years 1932 to 1935. Bolivia and Paraguay engage in a brutal, grinding war over this desolate territory.
It was an incredibly bloody conflict, fought in just appalling conditions. Tens of thousands of soldiers died from thirst and disease before even seeing combat. And oil was deeply, inextricably entangled in the narrative of why this war was happening.
Because Standard Oil was operating literally on the edge of the conflict zone.
Exactly. And as the war dragged on, the Bolivian economy began to hemorrhage. The military was struggling. And public anger naturally began to focus on the massive, wealthy foreign corporation sitting on their national reserves while the country bled.
Let's get into the mechanics of that anger, because there were specific accusations leveled at Standard Oil regarding their wartime conduct, right? They weren't just accused of being passive bystanders.
No. The Bolivian government and military accused the company of actively hindering the national war effort. They claimed Standard Oil was dragging its feet on refining aviation fuel for the Bolivian Air Force, and that they were demanding payments in foreign currency that the government simply didn't have. But the most explosive allegation, the one that provided the legal pretext for what happened next, involved clandestine smuggling.
The pipeline smuggling. I read the operational claims on this, and it's fascinating. The accusation was that Standard Oil had built a secret, unmetered pipeline crossing the border into Argentina. But, I mean, how do you hide an entire oil pipeline?
Well, you don't necessarily hide the pipe itself, you hide the flow. The allegation was that they had constructed a bypass system around the official metering stations. So while the Bolivian inspectors were recording a certain volume of oil being extracted and taxing it accordingly, a parallel, unrecorded volume was allegedly being pumped directly across the border to Standard's refineries in Argentina.
So they were essentially accused of stealing the subsoil wealth of a nation that is fighting for its literal survival and evading the royalties needed to fund the army. I mean, true or not, that is a potent political narrative.
Extremely potent.
And it boils over after the war concludes. On March 13th, 1937, the Bolivian government takes a monumental step. They officially nationalize Standard Oil of Bolivia's holdings. They seize the camps, the rigs, the wells, every piece of asset.
March 13th, 1937. It is a watershed moment. This is the first total expropriation of a major foreign oil company's assets in South American history.
Right.
It proved that the legal theory of resource nationalism could actually be enforced with military action.
Right.
The Bolivian state cited the alleged tax fraud, the clandestine pipeline to Argentina, and the failure to support the nation during the Chaco War as the legal justifications for the seizure.
And the shockwaves from this reached all the way to Washington. You have Huey P. Long, the incredibly powerful populist senator from Louisiana, standing up on the floor of the U.S. Senate and launching this blistering attack on Standard Oil. He coins the phrase oil imperialism.
Yes.
He basically puts forth the theory that Standard Oil actually orchestrated the entire Chaco War behind the scenes, funding Paraguay to attack Bolivia, all just to secure a favorable pipeline route to the Paraguay River.
And the rhetoric was explosive. It resonated deeply. Senator Long was tapping into this massive vein of anti-corporate sentiment fueled by the Great Depression. The narrative of a greedy, warmongering corporation manipulating sovereign nations for a pipeline route, it was a perfect political weapon.
Sure.
However, when we apply our documentary lens to this, we have to separate the political utility of that narrative from the historical consensus.
Right, because we want to stick to the facts here. So if I'm looking at modern historical scholarship, how does the Huey-Long oil war theory actually hold up?
It requires significant nuance. Scholars like Stephen C. Cole, publishing in journals like Diplomatic History, have really dismantled the simplistic oil war thesis. The granular causes of the Chaco War were rooted in century-old border disputes, national honor, and the disastrous miscalculations of both Bolivian and Paraguayan military leaders.
It wasn't just a corporate board game.
Exactly. Yes, Standard Oil's presence heightened the strategic value of the region. Yes, their actions during the war infuriated the Bolivian government. But the documentary evidence does not support the claim that a corporate boardroom orchestrated a regional war simply to lay down a pipe.
But, the political reality doesn't always wait for the nuanced historical consensus. Bolivia believed the narrative of betrayal, or at least they found it to be the perfect political lever, and they kicked Standard Oil out, they seized the assets, and the precedent was set.
The parallel state proved vulnerable. But if Bolivia was the first crack in the foundation, what happened exactly 1 year later was a full-scale earthquake that fundamentally altered the global energy map.
Right.
We have to look right across the U.S. border. We have to examine Mexico.
Mexico is where the concept of resource nationalism meets just unstoppable political momentum. And to understand the Mexican crisis of 1938, I want to contrast it with the Bolivia situation, because Bolivia acted largely out of the immediate trauma and economic desperation of the Chaco War. Mexico's expropriation was different. It was the culmination of a decades-long constitutional and social revolution.
The timeline is critical here. To grasp the severity of the Mexican clash, you have to look back to the era of Porfirio Diaz, the dictator who ruled Mexico with an iron fist until 1911. During the Diaz regime, foreign capital was invited in with virtually no restrictions.
Right.
Jersey Standard's primary subsidiary in Mexico, the Chaco Petroleum Company, operated along the Gulf Coast, particularly around Tampico, with sweeping, almost feudal privileges. They owned massive tracts of land outright, and under Diaz's laws, they owned the subsoil wealth absolutely.
It was the ultimate friendly environment for foreign capital. They were pulling millions of barrels of oil out of the ground, paying negligible taxes, and sending the profits straight back to New York. But 1911 isn't just the year Standard Oil gets broken up in the U.S., right? It's also the year the Mexican Revolution shatters the Diaz dictatorship.
Yes, and the intellectual heart of that revolution is eventually codified in the 1917 Mexican Constitution. This document is a masterpiece of resource nationalism, specifically Article 27.
Article 27.
The framers of the Constitution looked at the vast foreign-owned haciendas and the foreign-dominated oil fields, and they rewrote the fundamental rules of property. Article 27 explicitly stated that the direct ownership of all minerals and petroleum in the subsoil is vested in the Mexican nation.
Which instantly puts the foreign oil companies on a collision course with the new government. The companies are claiming absolute ownership based on old Diaz-era contracts. The new constitution says those resources belong to the Mexican people. But this collision doesn't happen overnight, does it? It's kind of a slow burn through the 1920s and 30s.
It was a war of legal attrition. The oil companies deployed endless injunctions, diplomatic pressure, threats of capital flight, all to prevent Article 27 from being fully applied retroactively to their holdings. And they largely succeeded in stalling the government for 2 decades. But the ultimate flashpoint didn't arise from a boardroom argument over constitutional theory. It started in the oil camps themselves. It started over labor.
Let's dig into the mechanics of the labor strike, because this is where the abstract concept of a parallel state hits the gritty reality of human working conditions. What was life actually like for a Mexican oil worker in a Standard Oil camp in the 1930s?
The disparity was stark, and it was deeply institutionalized. American and British technical staff lived in separate, well-maintained compounds. They had paved roads, modern sanitation, recreational facilities.
Basically a suburban bubble.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the Mexican roughnecks and laborers often lived in adjacent, overcrowded shantytowns. Many lacked basic plumbing or reliable clean water. Furthermore, wage discrepancies were massive. There were few safety protocols for what is incredibly dangerous rig work, and in some camps, workers were still paid in company scrip that could only be spent at company-owned stores rather than national currency.
It's essentially a system designed to extract wealth, not just from the ground, but from the labor force, while keeping them economically trapped.
Yes.
And so, by the mid-1930s, the newly formed Mexican Oil Workers Union decides they've had enough. They demand a collective bargaining, equal pay for equal work, health benefits, better living conditions. And when the companies refuse, The workers strike, and this isn't, a small localized picket line. They paralyze the entire national oil industry.
The strike created an immediate national emergency. Trains stopped running, factories lost power, the economy began to seize up.
Yeah.
So the Mexican government, led by President Lázaro Cárdenas, intervened and ordered an arbitration board to review the union's demands. The board conducted a massive audit of the oil company's finances and concluded that the companies were highly profitable and could easily afford the workers' demands. The companies, naturally, appealed this decision all the way to the Mexican Supreme Court.
And here is where the arrogance of the parallel state seals its own fate. The Mexican Supreme Court reviews the case and rules entirely in favor of the labor union. They order the oil companies to implement the pay raises and improve the conditions. What is Standard Oil's response?
They publicly defied the highest court of the sovereign nation in which they were operating.
That is just wow.
The corporate executives in New York and London calculated that President Cárdenas would blink. They believed that Mexico was too dependent on oil revenues and lacked the technical expertise to run the refineries themselves. They essentially told the Mexican government, "We will not obey your Supreme Court, and we dare you to do something about it."
It's breathtaking hubris. They pushed all their chips to the center of the table, betting that a sovereign nation would submit to corporate power. But President Cárdenas called the bluff.
He did.
On the evening of March 18, 1938, he goes on national radio and drops a bombshell. He didn't just enforce the labor ruling. He utilized the power of Article 27 and expropriated the entire foreign oil industry. Every derrick, every pipeline, every refinery, every office building belonging to 17 foreign firms, including Jersey Standard, was instantly nationalized and handed over to a newly created state company, Pemex.
And the sheer scale of that 1938 expropriation reshaped the global economy. Jersey Standard lost an empire overnight, but they did not accept defeat. The response from the oil majors was immediate, coordinated, and vicious. They launched a total economic war against the Mexican state.
Walk us through the mechanics of a corporate embargo. Because they don't have an army to blockade the ports, how does a company try to starve a nation into submission?
They leveraged their absolute control over the global petroleum supply chain. First, they blocked Mexico's access to oil tankers.
Okay.
Pemex had the oil, but they had no ships to move it. Second, they threatened any independent shipping company or foreign buyer with crippling lawsuits if they dared to purchase what they called stolen Mexican oil.
So nobody would buy it.
Right. And third, they embargoed all technical equipment and spare parts. You can't run a 1930s refinery without specialized American-made valves, gauges, and chemicals. The goal was to bring the Mexican oil industry to a grinding, mechanical halt, crash the national economy, and force Cárdenas to just hand the properties back.
And this ruthless corporate embargo creates one of the most dangerous geopolitical ironies of the 20th century. Because Mexico is a sovereign nation trying to survive an economic strangulation orchestrated by democratic Western corporations. They desperately need foreign currency. They need to sell their oil. So, with the American and British markets locked out by the corporate boycott, who was actually willing to buy boycotted Mexican crude in 1938,
the only nations willing to defy the corporate embargo and provide the hard currency and barter goods Mexico needed were the emerging fascist powers: Germany, Italy, and Japan.
the Axis powers. The embargo literally forced Mexico to fuel the German war machine.
It is a stark demonstration of how private corporate interests can directly undermine global security. Just as the Axis powers are aggressively militarizing and preparing to plunge the world into war, American and British oil companies are actively forcing a massive supply of Latin American crude oil into their hands.
Which has to be setting off alarm bells in the White House. This brings us to the role of the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the contrast here is fascinating, because if we look back a generation to the era of the United Fruit Company that we covered in Deep Dive 2, if a Latin American country nationalized an American corporate asset, the standard Washington playbook was gunboat diplomacy.
Oh, absolutely.
You send in the U.S. Marines, you overthrow the government, and you get the property back. But with oil, which is a far more vital strategic resource than bananas, FDR completely flips the script. He refuses to send the military. Why?
FDR's restraint is a masterclass in strategic prioritization. He was operating under his good neighbor policy, which deliberately sought to replace the heavy-handed military interventions of the past with diplomatic respect and hemispheric solidarity. But more importantly, FDR and his ambassador to Mexico, Josephus Daniels, were looking at the global chessboard.
They see the war coming.
Precisely. The calculus was completely clear. If the U.S. military invades Mexico to protect Standard Oil's profit margins, they instantly alienate every nation in Latin America. But the more terrifying immediate consequence was that a military threat would permanently drive Mexico into a formal binding alliance with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.
Wow.
The prospect of a hostile, Axis-aligned nation sharing a massive, porous border with the United States, potentially providing U-boat bases in the Gulf of Mexico, was FDR's absolute worst-case scenario.
So the U.S. government basically looks at Standard Oil and says, your private property rights do not supersede the national security of the United States.
FDR firmly restrained the oil executives. He completely took military intervention off the table. He informed Standard Oil that the U.S. government recognized Mexico's sovereign right to expropriate property, provided there was prompt and adequate compensation. He forced the companies into a grinding, multi-year diplomatic negotiation for a financial settlement. He was prioritizing a stable, friendly Mexico over corporate vengeance.
It's a profound moment where the agenda of the parallel corporate state and the agenda of the actual state diverge completely, and the actual state finally asserts dominance. But back in New York, the executives at Jersey Standard are looking at a catastrophe.
Yeah, they are.
They lost Bolivia in 1937. They lost the crown jewel of Mexico in 1938. The blunt force strategy of acting like untouchable lords, defying sovereign courts, and relying on U.S. military backing has failed spectacularly. They realize that if they don't fundamentally change their operating model, this wave of resource nationalism will sweep them out of Latin America entirely. They needed a firewall.
They needed a location where they still held immense power, but where they could apply the hard lessons of Tampico and the Gran Chaco. And that firewall was Venezuela.
Let's transition to the Venezuelan Compromise, because this is where the parallel state learns diplomacy. Jersey Standard operated in Venezuela primarily through a massive subsidiary called Creole Petroleum. What was the setup there before the crisis hit?
The initial dynamic in Venezuela was very similar to the Diaz era in Mexico. The original, incredibly lucrative concessions had been granted under the regime of Juan Vicente Gómez, a ruthless dictator who ruled Venezuela until his death in 1935.
Cool.
And under Gómez, foreign oil firms operated with almost total impunity. They extracted massive wealth while paying minimal royalties to the Venezuelan state.
But Gómez dies right as the wave of resource nationalism is cresting across the continent. Standard Oil is watching the fires burn in Bolivia and Mexico, and they know with absolute certainty that the new Venezuelan government is coming for those Gómez-era contracts next.
The tension was immense. The Venezuelan government, acutely aware of what had just happened in Mexico, began demanding a fundamental restructuring of the oil industry. They wanted higher taxes, more operational oversight, and a much greater share of the wealth.
Now, I want to look closely at the mechanics of this negotiation because it requires analyzing the motivations of all the players. You have Bolivia, which acted out of the trauma of a bleeding war. You have Mexico, which acted on the foundation of a constitutional mandate and a massive labor uprising. And then you have Venezuela, watching both of these events unfold.
Right.
Venezuela saw that Mexico gained its sovereignty but suffered a crippling embargo. Standard Oil saw that they could trigger an embargo, but they still lost billions in physical assets. Both sides basically looked at the smoking crater of the Mexican oil industry and decided they did not want to repeat that war of attrition.
It was a mutual realization that mutually assured economic destruction was a terrible business model. So they did something unprecedented in the history of the oil industry. They engaged in genuine high-level diplomatic compromise. And the result of this negotiation was the landmark 1943 hydrocarbons law in Venezuela.
So I'm looking at the core mechanism of this 1943 law, and I genuinely had to read the central provision twice. The law mandated a move toward a 50-50 split, a 50-50 division of the profits.
Yeah. That seems completely antithetical to everything Standard Oil fought so viciously to protect in Mexico. Did they really just surrender half their wealth?
Well, it wasn't a surrender. It was a brilliantly calculated strategic retreat. Let's examine the mechanics of how a 50-50 split actually functions.
Please do.
The law established a framework of royalties and income taxes designed to guarantee that the sovereign state of Venezuela would receive an amount equal to the net profits retained by the foreign oil companies. If Creole Petroleum made $100 million in profit after operational costs, the Venezuelan government would extract $50 million through taxes and royalties.
It fundamentally rewrites the relationship. The company is no longer an untouchable lord extracting tribute. They are legally bound partners sharing the financial yield of the resource. Why would Standard Oil agree to give up half the pie?
because the alternative was losing the bakery entirely. By conceding on the financial front, Standard Oil achieved their paramount strategic objective. They maintained absolute operational control over the oil fields, the refineries, and the export networks.
They avoided the Mexican scenario, where they were physically locked out of the facilities. 50% of a massively expanding industry was vastly preferable to 100% of an expropriated asset.
And this compromise ignited an absolute boom. With the political friction resolved, capital poured into Venezuela. Creole Petroleum eventually merged with another massive subsidiary, Lago, and expanded operations on Lake Maracaibo. By the late 1940s, Creole Petroleum wasn't just profitable, it became the largest single oil-producing entity in the entire world.
It really did.
The Venezuelan Compromise literally saved Jersey Standard's global standing.
It was a triumph of pragmatic diplomacy over corporate hubris. But the legacy of the 1943 Venezuelan hydrocarbons law extends far beyond the Caribbean.
Right, because a few years later, when nations in the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia, began demanding better terms from the American and British oil consortiums operating there, they didn't have to invent a new system.
No, they didn't.
They pointed directly at Caracas. The 50-50 split forged by Standard Oil's desperation in Venezuela became the standard operating template for the entire global petroleum industry for the next quarter century.
It perfectly demonstrates the immense structural power of a parallel state. When a massive corporation is forced to negotiate a treaty with a sovereign nation, the resulting architecture can literally reconfigure global commerce. Standard Oil proved they had the capacity to act as a geopolitical entity, capable of making international alliances and compromises.
Which is an incredible asset if you were trying to secure access to Latin American crude oil. But, that same capacity, that ability to sit at a table and negotiate massive binding international agreements as if you were a sovereign nation yourself becomes deeply perilous when you cross the Atlantic.
Yes.
What happens when a private American company uses that exact same diplomatic muscle to form a sweeping technological alliance with an emerging enemy of the United States?
And we are now pivoting to the gravest, most heavily documented, and most controversial chapter of this dossier. We are leaving the oil fields of Latin America and entering the chemical laboratories of Europe.
We are looking at the 1929 Cartel Agreement between Standard Oil and IG Farben. I want to set the stage here with extreme care. The year is 1929. The players are Jersey Standard, the largest oil company in the world, and IG Farben, a colossal German conglomerate.
To understand the gravity of this alliance, we really must define IG Farben. They were the undisputed titans of global chemical engineering. It was a massive cartel formed by the merger of several major German chemical firms.
Right.
Now, we must acknowledge their horrific future legacy. A decade later, IG Farben would become deeply integrated into the Nazi state. They notoriously manufactured the Zyklon B gas used in the Holocaust, and they operated massive slave labor facilities, most notably at Auschwitz-Monowitz.
It's a really grave historical reality.
It is. But in 1929, during the Weimar Republic era, before Adolf Hitler came to power, they were viewed globally as the absolute pioneers of industrial chemistry.
And in 1929, these two corporate empires sit down and construct an architecture of collusion. They sign a binding, multi-layered set of agreements that effectively creates a global cartel.
The foundational motive for this cartel was a technological anxiety that seems almost quaint today, but it was a driving obsession in the 1920s, the fear of peak oil.
Wait, peak oil in 1929? They seriously thought the Earth was running dry right after they just found massive fields in Texas and Latin America.
Well, geologic mapping was still in its infancy. The prevailing consensus among industry leaders was that natural, pumpable crude oil reserves would be exhausted within a decade or two. And if the world ran out of crude oil, the future of global energy would belong to whoever possessed the technology to manufacture synthetic liquid fuel from alternative sources.
Which brings us to the specific technology that IG Farben possessed. It's called coal hydrogenation. Let's do a deep dive into the actual science here. How do you turn a solid black rock into liquid gasoline?
It is an incredibly violent, mechanically complex chemical process. It was originally developed by a German chemist named Friedrich Burgius. Coal is extremely carbon heavy, but it lacks the hydrogen atoms necessary to form liquid hydrocarbon chains like gasoline.
Okay.
So the hydrogenation process involves taking pulverized coal, mixing it with heavy oil to create a paste.
Wait, so you're starting with solid rock here, turning it into paste?
Exactly. And then forcing hydrogen gas into the molecular structure of that paste under extreme conditions. We were talking about subjecting the mixture to massive atmospheric pressure and searing temperatures often exceeding 400 degrees Celsius in the presence of specialized metallic catalysts.
You are basically ripping the molecules apart and forcing them to bond with hydrogen to artificially create oil. That sounds insanely expensive and difficult to scale.
It was astronomically expensive. Building the high-pressure steel reactors required immense capital. But IG Farben had successfully mastered it at their seer, Leuna Works in Germany. They proved that a nation without natural oil reserves, but with abundant coal, could manufacture its own fuel.
And Jersey Standard looks at that technology and sees an existential threat. If oil runs out and Farben holds the patent for making fuel from coal, Farben becomes the new Standard Oil.
Yeah.
So Standard decides to buy the threat. They pay IG Farben a staggering sum, roughly $30 to $35 million in 1929 currency, paid largely in Standard Oil stock for the rights to utilize that hydrogenation process everywhere in the world outside of Germany.
The financial transaction was massive, but it was merely the entry fee for a much deeper structural alliance. The core of the 1929 agreement was a grand division of the global industrial map. They essentially drew a boundary line across the modern economy. They explicitly agreed that Standard Oil would maintain dominance over the global petroleum business, and IG Farben would maintain dominance over the global chemical business.
You stay out of my lane, I stay out of yours. But they went further than just a non-compete clause, didn't they? They agreed to pool their intellectual property.
Yes, they established a system of patent pooling. If either corporation invented a new process or product in areas where their industries overlapped, they were contractually obligated to share that technology with the other.
Wow.
They even created specialized joint venture companies, such as JASCO, the Joint American Study Company, specifically designed to develop and commercialize new synthetic materials, most notably synthetic rubber, which was known as BUNA.
Okay, let's look at this mechanism from a macro perspective for a second. It is analogous to taking two of the most dominant tech conglomerates today, say, one company that controls 80% of all global computer hardware and another that controls 80% of all software. They meet in secret and sign a pact.
Right.
The hardware giant promises never to develop software. The software giant promises never to manufacture a microchip. Furthermore, they agree to automatically share every patent they ever register in perpetuity. And crucially, they vow to honor this private contractual architecture regardless of what their respective national governments are doing.
The analogy perfectly illustrates the scale. And as we evaluate this historically, we must acknowledge that in 1929, an international cartel of this nature was considered a standard, if exceptionally large, business practice. The Sherman Antitrust Act existed in the U.S., but international patent pooling was a gray area that corporations heavily exploited to manage risk. It was pure commerce.
Sure.
But context is everything. As the 1930s grind on, the Weimar Republic collapses, the Third Reich rises, Germany aggressively rearms, the geopolitical context mutates completely, but the 1929 corporate contract remains static.
The paperwork signed in peacetime suddenly becomes the conduit connecting the American energy sector to the chemical engine of a militarizing fascist state. And Standard Oil, operating with the mindset of a parallel stateless entity, viewed their contract with IG Farben as sacrosanct. They believed their private corporate treaties were insulated from the brewing World War.
That belief proved disastrous, because when war finally erupted, the mechanics of this cartel translated directly into massive, documented strategic vulnerabilities for the United States military. This leads us to the core of the historical indictment against Standard Oil, the wartime costs of the cartel.
The documents lay out two specific, critical areas where the Standard Farben patent pooling agreements actively choked the American war effort: synthetic rubber and tetraethyl lead. Let's start with the rubber crisis, because the mechanics of this delay are infuriating. We mentioned the joint venture to develop BUNA synthetic rubber.
The science of synthetic rubber is highly complex. It involves polymerization, taking simple molecules derived from petroleum or coal and linking them into long, elastic chains.
Right.
IG Farben was at the absolute forefront of this technology. But as the 1930s drew to a close, the Nazi government recognized that synthetic rubber was a vital strategic asset for a mechanized army.
Right.
They stepped in and explicitly embargoed IG Farben from transferring the specific technical manufacturing know-how for BUNA rubber over to Standard Oil in the United States.
So the German state acts to protect its military advantage. Farben tells Standard, sorry, the government won't let us send you the blueprints.
Exactly. The German side of the cartel was superseded by the German state. But the critical failure, the action that brought down the wrath of the U.S. government, occurred on the American side. Standard Oil, adhering strictly to the spirit of their cartel agreement with their German partners, chose to wait.
Wow.
Even though they possessed partial knowledge of the Buna process, they deliberately stalled. They were incredibly slow to license what they did know about synthetic rubber to other American tire and rubber companies like Goodyear or Firestone.
Because if they shared the tech with American competitors, they would break their monopoly and violate the terms of the Farben cartel. They prioritized their exclusive commercial rights over fostering a robust domestic synthetic rubber industry.
They dragged their feet through 1940 and 1941, attempting to maintain absolute control over the patents. And then the geopolitical bill came due, December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor.
The U.S. is suddenly thrust into a two-front global war. And almost immediately, the Japanese Empire launches a massive offensive across Southeast Asia, conquering Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. In a matter of weeks, Japan captures the plantations that supply over 90% of the entire world's natural rubber.
The American supply chain evaporated almost overnight.
Think about the mechanics of an industrialized military in 1941. It's not just the obvious things like tires for jeeps or heavy bombers. Rubber is the essential connective tissue of war. It's the sealing gaskets inside naval ships. It's the electrical insulation wrapping every wire in a tank or a fighter plane. It's the hoses, the engine mounts, the medical supplies. An industrialized military without rubber simply cannot function. It is entirely paralyzed. And suddenly, the United States is staring into an abyss of a severe, critical rubber shortage.
And crucially, they did not have an existing scaled-up synthetic rubber industry ready to fill that massive void, in large part because of the deliberate delays engineered by Standard Oil to protect the Farben cartel. The ensuing crisis was so severe that it triggered one of the most famous congressional investigations in American history. In early 1942, the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program convened. The chairman was a pragmatic, fiercely determined senator from Missouri named Harry S. Truman.
The Truman Committee hearings. They haul the top executives of Standard Oil into Washington, put them under oath, and the testimony that follows is explosive. The U.S. Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, a man named Thurman Arnold, essentially opens up the filing cabinets. He lays out the memos, the contracts, the communications, proving that the cartel agreement with Farben directly caused the synthetic rubber bottleneck.
Senator Truman was appalled by what he saw in the documents. He did not mince his words. His committee concluded formally that Standard Oil did hamper the development of synthetic rubber in the United States. And Truman went further in press conferences, stating that the company's adherence to the German contract at the expense of national readiness approached the realm of treason. The public reaction was visceral. Time magazine covered the hearings with a scathing article titled, "Dinner Table Treason."
The rubber delay is the most thoroughly documented structural consequence of the cartel. But there is a second major technological issue highlighted in the documents, and this one involves the direct transfer of a critical military technology to the German war machine. Let's dig into tetraethyl lead, or TL. What exactly is this chemical, and why did it matter so much to a 1930s military?
To understand TEDL, you have to understand the mechanics of aviation engines. In the 1930s, aerospace engineers were trying to build faster, heavier aircraft fighters and bombers. To get more power, you need higher compression ratios in the engine cylinders. However, if you run normal, low-octane fuel in a high-compression engine, the intense pressure causes the fuel to detonate prematurely before the spark plug fires.
That's engine knock, right? If you've ever driven an older car up a steep hill and heard that rattling, pinging sound from the engine block, that's the fuel detonating uncontrollably. In an airplane engine, severe knock will physically tear the pistons apart mid-flight.
Precisely. You cannot build a modern high-performance Air Force without high-octane fuel that resists knocking. And the primary method discovered in the 1920s to instantly boost the octane rating of aviation fuel was to add a highly toxic organometallic compound called tetraethyl lead.
And who held the absolute monopoly on the complex manufacturing process for TEL?
A company called the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation, which was a joint venture owned 50-50 by Standard Oil of New Jersey and General Motors.
So an American corporate monopoly controls the key additive required to fly a modern bomber.
Yes. But in 1935, as the Luftwaffe was secretly rebuilding in violation of the Versailles Treaty, the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation entered into an agreement to transfer the technical know-how to manufacture tetraethyl lead directly to Germany. They established a joint venture inside Germany, partnering once again with IG Farben.
And this wasn't done in the dark, right? I mean, the U.S. War Department explicitly warned them against doing this. The U.S. government recognized the strategic threat of giving the Germans the technology to fuel a modern air force and begged the companies to stop.
They did. But the executives at Ethel, Standard, and GM felt that the commercial opportunity in the German market outweighed the diplomatic concerns of Washington. They proceeded with the transfer. They provided the blueprints and the technical expertise to build the TEL manufacturing plants that would eventually supply the Luftwaffe.
And the documentary record shows it goes even further than just building the factories. In 1938, as war in Europe is imminent, the German plants still aren't producing enough to TEL to stockpile for a major conflict. The Luftwaffe is desperately short on the additive.
So they turned to their corporate partners. An export subsidiary connected to Ethel arranged an emergency loan of a massive 500-ton consignment of finished tetraethyl lead. This shipment was facilitated through the Reich Air Ministry and IG Farben and delivered directly into German hands just before the outbreak of the war.
Let's synthesize what this all means for a second. The mechanics of the parallel state operated exactly as designed, but with catastrophic results. A private corporate contract superseded national security. Standard Oil kept its word to IG Farben. It zealously protected its patents, it delayed American rubber production, and it actively shared vital aviation fuel technology, even as IG Farben became the undisputed engine of the Nazi war machine, and even as the U.S. government explicitly told them to stop.
That is the factual, meticulously documented reality of a multinational corporation operating without borders or allegiance. But as we established at the beginning of this deep dive, those documented facts are damning enough on their own. The tragedy of this history is that because the truth is so shocking, it has spawned a massive, obscuring web of historical myths and conspiracy theories.
Which is why we need to rigorously separate the facts from the fiction. Guarding the historical record is vital, because when you are dealing with history this volatile, precision is everything. If critics invent sensationalized myths about a corporation, it allows that corporation's lawyers to easily swat away the fake claims, and in doing so, they cast doubt on the actual documented wrongdoing. So let's look at the popular fictions and pull them apart.
The most pervasive and resilient myth you will encounter online is the claim that Standard Oil tankers actively, physically refueled German U-boat submarines at sea in the middle of the Atlantic or in secret coves in the Caribbean, flying under neutral Panamanian flags to avoid detection.
The idea of a massive Exxon tanker pulling up alongside a Nazi U-boat in the dead of night to pump fuel, what does the actual naval and documentary records say about this?
It is an absolute myth. It is not supported by credible naval historians or the captured records of the German Kriegsmarine. The logistics of the Atlantic Naval War render it absurd. The German U-boat fleet did not rely on American corporate oil tankers for mid-ocean refueling. They extended their operational range using their own specialized, heavily armed supply submarines, which the German sailors referred to as milch cows or milk cows.
Right. I mean, the logistics of trying to secretly rendezvous a massive, slow-moving commercial tanker with a submarine in the middle of a war zone patrolled by Allied destroyers makes zero operational sense.
Furthermore, the reality of 1942 in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, the very waters where this myth supposedly takes place, was the exact reverse. During Operation Drumbeat, German U-boats were aggressively hunting and slaughtering Allied merchant shipping, including a massive number of Standard Oil tankers. Wow. The company lost dozens of ships and hundreds of mariners to the torpedoes of the very U-boats they are rumored to have been fueling. The refueling claim is fiction, and it disrespects the mariners who died.
Myth completely busted. Okay, myth number 2. You often hear that Standard Oil supplied nearly all of the bulk fuel that ran the Luftwaffe and the Panzer divisions during the Blitzkrieg.
This is mathematically false, or at best, a massive distortion of the industrial reality. Germany did not fight the Second World War running primarily on secret imports of American petroleum. The Nazi war machine was fueled by two main sources. First, captured crude oil fields, primarily the massive Ploieti fields in Romania, and second, domestic synthetic fuel.
The irony being that the synthetic fuel was produced using the exact coal hydrogenation plants built by IG Farben, the technology Standard Oil bought into.
Precisely. Germany manufactured its own fuel from its own coal. The real, narrower, historically documented story regarding fuel is the technology transfer. The tetraethyl lead additive that made the aviation fuel potent, the patents, the rubber delay, that is where the genuine culpability lies, not in imaginary, massive, secret pipelines of bulk crude oil supplying the Wehrmacht.
Let's address myth number 3, the neutral port loophole. This claim suggests that Standard Oil deliberately and systematically diverted massive amounts of oil directly to the German military by routing tankers through neutral ports like fascist Spain or Vichy French territories in North Africa.
This one requires a bit more nuance to debunk because there were absolutely genuine wartime controversies regarding oil shipments. There were intense diplomatic fights between the U.S. State Department and the British Ministry of Economic Warfare over petroleum reaching Axis powers via neutral Spain. There were arguments over the outputs of standard refineries in places like Aruba. But the sweeping sensationalist framing that Standard Oil executives in New York were intentionally and directly routing oil to the Nazi military outruns the hard evidence. The U.S. and British governments were constantly monitoring, restricting, and often authorizing these flows based on complex diplomatic calculations regarding keeping Spain out of the war.
So, as a listener trying to navigate the history of corporate power, how do you synthesize this? You weigh it by the documents. The proven facts hiding rubber tech and transferring aviation additives to a fascist state are profoundly grave. You don't need to invent U-boat refueling to indict the cartel. And armed with the documented truth of the rubber shortage, the U.S. government finally brought the parallel state to a reckoning.
We enter the final phase of the timeline. Crime and punishment. It is March 1942. The U.S. has suffered Pearl Harbor. The Truman Committee has publicly exposed the rubber crisis. Thurman Arnold has built an ironclad antitrust case utilizing the captured memos of the cartel. How does the Department of Justice corner a corporation that acts like a sovereign nation?
Let's look at the legal mechanics here. The DOJ doesn't initially push for a massive, multi-year criminal trial. They push for a specific legal instrument, an antitrust consent decree. How does that work?
A consent decree is essentially a high-stakes settlement. The government approaches the corporation and says, "We have the evidence to destroy you in open court, but we are in the middle of a world war, and a 5-year trial distracts from production. So, if you sign this document, you agree to our terms, you change your behavior, and in exchange, you do not have to legally admit guilt, and we drop the criminal prosecution."
So Thurman Arnold basically puts a gun to their head. Sign this decree, open up your patents, or we take you to court right now in the middle of a war where boys are dying because of a rubber shortage, and we let a jury brand you as traitors. Standard Oil calculates the immense PR and legal risk, and they fold. On March 25th, 1942, they sign the consent decree.
They settle the antitrust charges regarding the IG Farben cartel. Now, we have to examine the punishment outlined in that decree. The headline penalty, the one that made the news, was a fine. Standard Oil was ordered to pay a total of $50,000.
I have to stop on that number. $50,000 for a company that was literally drafting laws in Latin America, moving billions of barrels of oil, and trading tens of millions of dollars in stock with IG Farben just for patent rights. Was a $50,000 fine just the cost of doing business? It sounds like a parking ticket for a parallel state.
It is incredibly easy to look at that number, which, by the way, is often misreported in lazy sources as a mere $5,000 across several executives. But the total corporate fine was $50,000 and conclude the punishment was an absolute joke. Furthermore, the human accountability was non-existent. No Standard Oil executives went to prison.
Wow.
William S. Farish, the president of the company who fiercely defended the cartel during the Truman hearings, faced intense public scrutiny and humiliation, but zero criminal charges. He actually died of a heart attack a few months later.
So looking at the fine and the lack of jail time, they basically got away with it.
That is the superficial reading. But if we dig into the mechanical reality of the consent decree, the $50,000 was merely a symbolic slap. The actual devastating punishment embedded in the document involved intellectual property.
The patents.
The consent decree legally forced Standard Oil to immediately release roughly 2,000 patents, entirely royalty-free. Every single piece of technology, every chemical process, every blueprint for synthetic rubber and hydrogenation tied up in the IG Farben cartel was suddenly forcibly liberated.
They open-sourced the monopoly.
Exactly. Standard Oil was forced to hand all that suppressed technology over to the U.S. government, and more painfully to their domestic competitors. The government took that intellectual property, handed it to the broader American chemical and rubber industry, and jump-started a massive collective manufacturing effort overnight. The consent decree shattered Standard Oil's technological stranglehold, and it finally allowed the United States to build the synthetic rubber plants required to win the Second World War.
It's a fascinating legal maneuver. The government didn't put the executives in jail, they just confiscated the architecture of their power and used it to win the war.
Right.
But it leaves us with an incredible, lingering question regarding accountability.
Right.
When a multinational corporation reaches a scale where its internal boardroom decisions, its private patent pooling, its quiet handshakes actively dictate the military readiness of nations and impact the trajectory of global wars, can traditional legal systems actually hold them accountable? Can a consent decree and a forced release of patents ever truly balance the moral scales against actions that the future President of the United States described as treasonous?
It is the defining structural question of globalized capitalism. The domestic justice system is built to handle individuals and localized companies. It is fundamentally ill-equipped to govern massive stateless entities that possess the capital and leverage to negotiate treaties with foreign powers and carve the globe into private fiefdoms.
Which brings our journey to a close today. Let's chase the through line of what we've unpacked. We started by watching the 1911 legal breakup of a domestic monopoly accidentally forge an even more powerful, outward-facing parallel state. We saw Jersey Standard relocate its ambitions to Latin America, building infrastructure, drafting laws, and ultimately colliding with the massive sovereign force of resource nationalism.
We observed the mechanics of three distinct sovereign reactions to that corporate power. We saw Bolivia, battered by the Chaco War, enforce a nationalization out of grievance in 1937. We saw Mexico, standing on constitutional right and labor defiance, expropriate an entire industry in 1938 and survive a ruthless corporate embargo thanks to the strategic diplomatic restraint of FDR.
Right.
And we saw the 1943 compromise in Venezuela, where the 50-50 split demonstrated that a corporation could negotiate like a sovereign state, creating a financial template that reshaped the global energy economy.
And finally, we tracked that same sovereign negotiating power across the Atlantic to examine its darkest consequence. The 1929 Cartel alliance with IG Farben, a private contract that superseded borders, delayed American synthetic rubber production through complex patent pooling right when the military needed it most, and transferred vital aviation fuel chemistry to a fascist regime. We separated the historical documented facts of the Truman Committee hearings from the fictions of U-boat refueling.
We have analyzed the mechanics of how a single company navigated a world of empires, revolutions, and world wars, utilizing legal leverage, embargoes, and patent pools. But as we close, I want to apply this historical lens to our present moment. We've spent this time detailing the geopolitics of oil pipelines, coal hydrogenation, and synthetic rubber patents. But consider the landscape today. We live in an era where data, artificial intelligence, and communications infrastructure flow across borders infinitely faster than petroleum ever could. If a massive, contemporary multinational tech corporation, a company with a GDP larger than most nations, were to sign a binding secret data sharing or algorithmic patent agreement with a hostile foreign power today, how would we respond? Do we currently possess better, faster legal mechanisms to halt that technological transfer than a Senate committee hearing and a consent decree? Or are we, nearly a century after the Truman hearings, still fundamentally relying on parallel corporate states to simply police their own patriotism?
That is a staggering thought to sit with, and exactly why we dig into the archives. The architecture of power changes, but the mechanics remain incredibly similar. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives you are handed, look past the easy myths, and always look for the documents. We will catch you next time.